Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and now with Sports Info Solutions, joined by Aaron Schatz, the godfather of football analytics and the founder of FootballOutsiders.com. As always, we've got Justin Stein with us on the controls. And Aaron, we're going to kind of do a little hodgepodge today. One thing that I definitely wanted to start off right off the top with you about was I saw on FootballOutsiders.com something about the value of mock drafts. And I got to be honest, as me, former scout, now with Sports Info Solutions, I find mock drafts to be the most valueless thing in the world. I can't stand mock drafts. I think they're a waste of time. I even hate it when Sports Info Solutions does mock drafts. What is this research about mock drafts actually having some value?
Yeah, so this is done by a guy named Benjamin Robinson, and he has a site called Grinding the Mocks. And he sort of discovered by collecting data from mock drafts that actually mock drafts do a fairly good job of predicting where guys are going to go in the actual draft. There's sort of a wisdom of crowds element to it, that once you sort of, once you combine a lot of mock drafts, and he weights them so that certain people who do mock drafts who've had, more success and been more accurate in the past get weighted higher. But you end up with this sort of wisdom of crowds result that gives you a good idea of where players are actually going to be drafted. Although he definitely found that certain positions that there was a tendency for players to be listed too early in mock drafts, quarterback in particular, wide receiver. Interestingly enough, not running back. Like I would have expected that mock drafts would overvalue running backs because some of the people who do them come from sort of a fantasy football background, but they actually don't. And the one position is interesting. The one position that mock drafts continually undervalue is center, although that might just be a sample size thing because there were only like 12 centers in his sample. But it's sort of an interesting article showing that mock drafts do have some value in that helping you to sort of get an idea of where players are being considered. And it's fairly accurate to what teams are considering.
Yeah, I brought it up. I'll admit it, as much as I do hate mock drafts and I try to avoid them, I really did like this article because I think that it brought out something really interesting. And that is a frustration that I always had as a scout, which was as you put together your draft board, you are told by your GM that you're supposed to be scouting players based on what they'll be on your team. But inherently, if you're doing a good job of doing that, then you're not really caring about how the league values that player. So I was always a proponent of having two draft boards, one for what you believe the players are going to be on your team and one for what you believe the market value is. And I really think this article, by using the mock drafts, creates a good system for being able to do that totally objectively. And I think it's really interesting because, like you said, you're going to overvalue some positions and you're going to undervalue others. So this just puts it all into one coherent sort of context so that you can, not rely on that, but at least have a range for different positions, different players of where they might go. So you know where you need to be in order to get the guys you want.
One of the things that's interesting about this, and it's only based on a couple of years of data. So obviously, results would be better, once he's got more years. But one of the things that's interesting is which teams have the least amount of draft surplus value compared to where mock drafts are. Because I think what that does is point out which teams tend to go off on their own and do stuff different from the wisdom of the crowds. Cleveland, Atlanta, Seattle, San Francisco, and Tampa Bay were the teams that stood out for sort of drafting guys earlier than the general expectation.
Right. And I thought what he found was interesting, that it doesn't necessarily make you better or worse at drafting. It's just kind of you're more divergent in where you're willing to go for people relative to where they're expected to go.
Right. Well, especially after only a couple of years of this, these players haven't even finished their first contract yet. So there's no way to tell whether those teams are better or worse at drafting. But, all the research that shows that no team is really that much better at drafting than any other team, that most teams are pretty much, there's a lot of randomness to whether teams draft well or don't draft well, but they do draft differently.
Right. And I guess it stands to reason then that kind of on average that all of the teams don't draft any better or worse than all of the teams. who don't draft any better or worse than one another over time.
Yeah, I mean, there's no indication that the teams here that draft, they tend to get surplus value compared to mock drafts. Tennessee, Buffalo, Dallas, that those teams in the last couple of years have really drafted that much better than Seattle, Atlanta, Cleveland. You know, the one thing I will say is I've gone back and looked at it, and it is true that when teams draft a player 3 or 4 rounds earlier than where they're projected by most DraftNix sites, those picks almost never end up well.
Yeah, and that makes sense because I don't even understand what the reasoning would be for something like that. Really interesting stuff there. And yeah, of course, like we're talking about, there's so many aspects that aren't considered here. Like if you accumulate draft picks, I think both of us would agree that's going to be a much better strategy than trying to outdraft other people or to have an understanding of even the marketplace better than somebody else does. Accumulating picks, I think when you look back historically, is the only strategy that's proven to get you more value.
Right, absolutely.
All right.